and we want to wish everybody once again a happy Easter. Thank you all for coming out. I'm going to take a few minutes to reflect back on what actually happened on the day of resurrection, the day that Christ got up. We have to acknowledge the same way we did with Christmas, when around Christmas time we had a Bible study and we talked about how Christmas came to be, and we discussed that it was a fusion, or the technical term is syncretism, where they took pagan practices and combined them with Christian observances and mashed them together, and that's how the Christmas season evolved. And Easter is kind of the same kind of animal, to where at one point in time, just about every culture had a spring equinox, and they would give thanks to their gods, whoever their gods were, for bringing them through the winter, for having survived the winter. Because surviving the winter wasn't a given. They didn't have heat, they didn't have homeless shelters, they didn't have a lot of things that we take for granted today. And we talked about the fact that the winter solstice was a celebration. Let's have a big party because we might not see each other after this is all said and done. Spring equinox was a big celebration. Hey, we made it, we survived, and they wanted to give thanks to their deities and their gods for having made it through the winter. Along comes Christianity. People start to convert to Christianity. They maintain the cultural practices, the cultural celebration of, yay, we made it through the winter, but now they begin to associate it with Christ, and they elected to observe the resurrection of Christ around this time, because we know historically that Christ was resurrected around the time of the Passover, which happened to coincide with the spring and with equinox. He was crucified the day before the day of the Passover, depending on who you read, and he got up 3 days later. And we know that he got up. There's a lot of debate. Oh, for example, you can take Genesis, the book of Genesis, and you can debate over whether or not it actually happened exactly the way it was written, because realistically nobody was there. It could be an allegory, it could be meant to be taken literally. There are a lot of very sound debates over what to do with Genesis. Resurrection is a little bit different. When he pops up and is in front of 500 people at one time, or people touch him and they eat with him, and you have historians having recorded the resurrection of Christ, you have something much more concrete and much more solid to be able to look back to and say that this is something that in fact did happen, if we choose to believe the record. I'm going to scoot this over a little bit because it's written. If we choose to believe historical record, it's, excuse me just 1 second. Saw that coming. I have a hard head, I'm okay. We have a lot of people who approach Easter, Christianity in general, with a large degree of skepticism, and it's always interesting to listen to what things they do choose to believe in society and pop culture and gossip mills, and how easily they can be persuaded one way or another. But on the other hand, you have something where you have a considerable amount of evidence that this in fact did happen, and you can choose to believe, they can choose not to believe, but we understand and we know from experience, from our relationship with Christ, that he did in fact rise. And most of the time we celebrate that, and we understand that in an eternal context. We understand that his sacrifice and his resurrection was God's stamp of approval on the sacrifice that he made to atone for our sins. And that tends to be the context that we look at it, that we can make it to heaven, we can be saved because he got up. If he would have just died, then he would have just been another religious, philosophical leader who was put to death and didn't get up. But the fact that God got him out of the grave showed a sign of approval on his work. And because of that, our salvation is valid, and we are eternally secured a place in his kingdom for in this life and in the next. They saw it a little bit differently in the biblical days, though. If you take back and you peel back the layers of theology, and you peel back the layers of evolution, there was a much more practical understanding of what the resurrection looked like to them. And that's what we want to try to talk about, and what we want to try to deal with today is understanding the resurrection, understanding and being able to relate to what the people who were experiencing were dealing with, and how it impacted them and how it affected them before they were thinking about eternity and salvation. it was huge for the fact that Christ got up. So there's a lot of, there's four gospels and there's four different accounts of the resurrection that have some overlap and some differences. We're going to kind of smash a couple of them together for a coherent record of what actually happened. But in Mark, the 16th chapter, in the first verse, it says, Saturday evening, and I'm reading New Living Translation. Saturday evening, when the Sabbath ended, Mary Magdalene, the mother of James, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome went out and purchased burial spices so they could anoint Jesus' body. Very early on Sunday morning, just at sunrise, they went to the tomb. On the way, they were asking each other, who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb? But as they arrived, they looked up and saw the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled aside. When they entered the tomb, they saw a young man clothed in a white robe sitting on the right side. The women were shocked, but the angel said, "Don't be alarmed. You are here looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He isn't here. He is risen from the dead. Look, this is where they laid his body. Now go tell the disciples, including Peter, that Jesus is going ahead of you to Galilee. You will see him there, just as he told you before he died." The women fled from the tomb, trembling and bewildered, and they said nothing to anyone because they were too frightened. After Jesus rose from the dead early on Sunday morning, the first person who saw him was Mary Magdalene, a woman from whom he had cast out 7 demons. She went to the disciples, who were grieving and weeping, and told them what had happened. But when she told them that Jesus was alive and she had seen him, they did not believe her. Afterwards, he appeared in a different form to 2 of his followers who were walking from Jerusalem to the country. They rushed back to tell the others, but no one believed them. I'm going to jump over to John, the 20th chapter and the 19th verse. That Sunday evening, the disciples were meeting behind locked doors because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders. Suddenly, Jesus was standing there among them. "Peace be with you," he said. As he spoke, he showed them the wounds in his hands and on his side. They were filled with joy when they saw the Lord. Again he said, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I am sending you." Then he breathed on them and said, "Receive ye the Holy Spirit." So we're going to work with that narrative and with that story as we read it, and speak from the subject, the morning after. The morning after. We picked up and we were dealing with, in the beginning of Mark, after Christ's crucifixion, he was laid in a tomb. And their tombs weren't like what we have now, where you have the nice burial plots and everything like that. Actually, it was unusual to have somebody that was crucified be buried, period. Usually they just threw them all in a pit, and that's where the bodies lay. But Joseph of Arimathea was a very influential person and wanted to preserve his body. So they took his body, wrapped him up, and put him in a grave. And then they put a stone in front of the grave. And by all historical measurements of the way that they used to do this, stone was about 600 pounds, between 600 and 800 pounds. It was enormous. Because the Passover was on its way, which was a Jewish religious observance, we won't get into the details of what that was, but they had a Jewish religious observance coming up. They did not go through the normal burial procedures of preserving the body and anointing it and going through the customary way that you would honor somebody that is going to be buried. They just wrapped them up, used a little bit of preservative, threw them in there, rolled the stone in front of it, and placed a 16-man guard in front of the tomb, just because he said he was getting back up, and they didn't want anybody stealing his body and saying that he got back up. I want you to imagine for a moment what it was like for the people who saw Christ be crucified. In order to understand the significance of the resurrection, you have to have some kind of a sense of what they dealt with and what they lost when they saw Jesus was being crucified. For us, I mean, we all suffer loss, and we have loss of loved ones and people that we care about, and we deal with that. But this was much more significant to them. His disciples and his followers believed him to be the Messiah. And the Messiah was the person who was supposed to be delivering Israel from the bondage of the Roman guard, of the nation of Rome. But there was more to it than just political freedom tied into that. We talked last time that we met about how closely agrarian societies are tied to the land. We talked about the fact that if the land was cursed, then nobody was doing well. People in that point in time, because they were agricultural, because they were farmers, they derived their identity from their land. We know and understand that there are very few things that can be more disheartening and destructive to the psyche than to be displaced from your land. It can be completely destructive as they displace people. We understand what the implications and the ramifications of that can be. So to be in captivity to another culture or to another nation, to have them have control over your land, to them and to their culture meant that the people, the indigenous people, in this case Israel, no longer had free self-determination. Their life, their existence was dictated by somebody else. It was a very shameful existence to be under the control of another power, even though these things happen all the time and you had nations and empires come and take over. It was a degree of shame that they carried with them, that they didn't have their land. They weren't owners of their land. They didn't have the control or the freedom to be able to determine what their life was going to be, but they always lived under subjugation to somebody else's whims. Whatever they said, whatever they determined was going to, whatever they decreed would affect the quality of living that Israel would experience. And so in looking for the Messiah, it wasn't just, we want, we don't want to be occupied anymore, but they were looking for a freedom and a sense of self-determination and a removal of shame, removing that shame and restoring the honor of being an independent nation. That's what the Messiah represented to the nation of Israel. What they were looking for was, we want to have a freedom to determine and experience life on our own, independent of any outside influences. And for them, that's also what salvation meant. For us, we talk about salvation as freedom from sin, freedom from going to hell. They were looking for deliverance from anything that would cripple them from being able to experience a productive and fruitful life at this time. It's a large paradigm shift between the way that they envisioned things and the way they saw things, and the way that we tend to. So that's the general concept of the Messiah, and you add in the ministry of Christ, who came to power, or who came to popularity amongst the people because he taught in a way that made people feel like it doesn't matter where you come from or what your situation is. You matter. You have honor afforded to you that other people don't necessarily see. The establishment may treat you like you're insignificant. Religious leaders may treat you like you're unclean. But God sees you differently, and we're going to have a kingdom where you will have an honor conferred upon you because you follow these doctrines, because you follow these teachings. An honor will be conferred upon you that is greater than the dishonor that other people try to impose upon you. Whereas your status and your stature may not be the most honorable. In the kingdom, everybody shares an honor that flows from God. And I'm talking about honor so much because in that culture there was nothing more important. It was a central cultural value, honor and shame. The play between being honored and being shamed dictated their life the way economics dictates our life. It affected the quality of life that you were going to experience. It affected the opportunities that you were going to have in your life, whether or not you were considered honorable or whether or not you carried a weight of shame. We, like I said, in this country, our life's determination is usually centered around economics. We value acquisition of wealth, acquisition of materials. That's what buys you opportunities. We judge a person's life based on how affluent they become and how much material they acquire, or what academic achievements that they may acquire over the course of their lifetime. For them, it was honor. It was like the credit rating. It was what they used to be able to barter, to be able to trade, to be able to take out a loan. And one of the things that was significantly different with their society was that they, in America, in theory, the way it's supposed to work is that if you work hard and you make the right decisions It doesn't matter where you are, you have the ability to establish a life that was better than the generation before you, that you can come up and you can develop. That's how they tell us it's supposed to work. Whether or not everybody experiences that, whether or not that's the reality of America is something completely different, but that's the American dream. That's the theory. They didn't have that back then. They knew when they understood that it doesn't matter how much and how hard we work. Where we were born is pretty much where we're going to die. There was no illusion or idea that if we spend our lives working hard, we're going to acquire and amass a lot of wealth. That's not the way their society worked. They knew you were born into a certain place with a certain degree of honor, and the best that you were going to be able to do was to be able to continue in that and live honorably there, to be respected and to be able to get by and to survive. So the whole entrepreneurial, enterprising ideology, they didn't really deal with, and they knew that the only way you advance in society was to have honor conferred upon you from somebody else. If somebody who was considered, if a king said that you were something greater than what your station was, well then now you have advanced. If the governor decides that he's going to confer something, a position on you, now you've advanced. And that was really the only way to get ahead. That was the only way that you were going to be able to move forward in society or experience a better quality of life. So when we talk about the Messiah, and when we talk about Jesus, and we talk about his ministry, and him promising them that they would have an honor that was greater than what they had experienced, an honor that came from God that nobody else could take away, we're really talking about the hopes and dreams of the people that bought in and the people that began to follow him were looking for a greater a greater quality of living, a greater life experience. And they were looking for liberty and determination and self-determination and freedom from shame. And there were all of these things that were tied up into following Christ. That's what they saw hung up on the cross when he was crucified, which doesn't make any sense for what they believed. They're thinking this person might be the Messiah, the chosen one, the Son of God. And now they see their hopes and dreams for the future hung up on a cross. And on that cross, the nature of the way that he died was the most shameful way that you could imagine dying in society. It's not just because it was the cross. If Rome had just put Jesus to death on their own, that he could have been considered a martyr. That death could have been an honorable death, because there were plenty of people who tried to foment revolution and were executed but were considered honorable within society. It's one thing to have your enemies come and take you out, but when your own people turn you over to be killed, that's a whole nother level of disrespect. When his people turn him over to the Roman authorities to be put to death, the level of shame that is attached to that is impossible for us to be able to understand in our society because we're so far removed. It would be like having your mother come and testify against you in a sentencing hearing of a capital case. It's kind of embarrassing. It just does not fit the narrative in the story. And then he's accused of being a blasphemer. You see this person that your hopes and dreams have been built on, and that you've left your family and you've left your friends and you've started to follow, and he is beaten, he's treated like a criminal, he's accused of these acts, and you really don't know what to believe at that point in time, because it's beyond comprehension that someone who might be the Son of God could possibly deal with this. It's beyond comprehension that somebody who has made these kind of promises is going to be going through this. It's not a pleasant experience when your plans for your life get completely derailed in the course of 24 hours, or the hopes and dreams that you have and the things that you thought were going to provide you with a better quality of living and a better quality of life and freedom and get you out from underneath the powers that have been oppressing you and keeping you bound and tied up. When all of a sudden that hope is snatched from you in a moment, it is a severely traumatic experience. And not only was it traumatic to see that, but the shame that came with that cross suddenly became cast on everybody that followed him. Everybody that was a follower of his. That's why Peter denied him 3 times and said, if you don't get away from me, I'm going to cut you, because everything was going sideways. And by association, the shame that, just as the honor that Christ claimed that he was going to bring would have been conferred to all of his followers, the shame that came with the cross came down on everybody else. The weight of that is incalculable. We know how we felt when we reacted when the Twin Towers fell on 9/11, how scary that was and how frightening that was. Well, these were some personal towers that came crashing down in their lives, and all of a sudden they didn't know which end was up. They were afraid, they were grieving, they were shamed, they didn't know what the future and what their life was going to look like. That's what the crucifixion looked like to them. We get together and we have our nice services because we know the other side of the story. They were terrified. It was a horrible experience for every last one of them. And so they mourned and they grieved and they hid. And the Passover was coming and the Sabbath was coming. They had two major religious ceremonies that they had to deal with or that they had to be a part of. They didn't even have time to process it. I don't know if you've ever experienced having a bunch of things go wrong at once and you don't have time to recover and get your head together before you can and process what's happening before you can move on and deal with anything else. But that was the situation and the state that they found themselves in. And we pick up, said all of that to get to Mary and Mary Magdalene and Salome, and there was a huge company of women. As you read the different Gospels, there were a huge company of women that the morning after the Sabbath, decided that they were going to go and pay respects to Christ. Like we said, he was not buried properly. And so while it's interesting and funny to think about the fact that Christ had 12 disciples, 11 after Judas betrayed him, so 11 disciples left over, had trained with him, walked with him, been taught with him. But these women were the ones who decided we're going to get up and go try to honor Jesus. They were hiding, they were afraid, they were grieving, and but they thought we're going to go and honor him. We don't know how we're going to honor him because we got a 600-pound stone in the way. And I don't know how that's going to get moved. I don't understand how we're going to do this, but they bought people who were poor, spent the time, and bought the spices, bought the oils that they needed, and went to the gravesite with the expectation that they were going to find a body there, and somehow or another, maybe they could make nice with the guards, and the guards would offer to move it, but somehow or another, we're going to honor and respect this person that we had such hope in. In a sense, what they began to do was to re-engage in a relationship with Christ. Even though they had an insurmountable obstacle, they had no idea how they were going to get by. They had no idea what they were how they were going to get by the stone. They had no idea how they were going to get to Christ. Their love for him compelled them to re-engage and to try to relate and to try to do something to show how much they loved him and how much they appreciated him. Tragedies come, we experience things, and a lot of times it causes us to shy away from God. It causes us to abandon our relationship with him. It causes us to abandon our faith. It causes us to abandon our belief. Because we have things that happen that just don't fit and they don't make sense. And so what we believe must not have been true. What we believe must have been, another pipe dream, or we thought we had it together and it's just another person selling us another bill of goods, or it's another gimmick. But because they re-engaged and because they committed themselves to this, I can't tell you for sure that they believed at that point. But they said, we love this person enough that we're going to take the time and try to offer up to him or to do something for him to reflect how much love we have for him. And it's when they got there that they found an affirmation of their hope. What they found in the empty tomb, when they see an angel and they see grave clothes there, they don't see the destruction, the dead body and the dead hope that they expected to find there, but instead they find an angel telling them he's alive. He's still there. He got up. Your Messiah, your Savior, the hope for your future, all of these things that were attached to him got up with him. Because what that means is that something happened, that there was a divine affirmation, a divine validation of what they believed and what they had hoped for. Because nobody, people don't just get up. They went there expecting a body. The disciples were sitting there mourning and grieving, and when they tried to tell him he's up, nobody believed him. But because they got up that morning, early in the morning, and this is why you have early morning services, because they cared enough to re-engage with God, in spite of, or with Christ, in spite of the fear, in spite of the questions, in spite of not knowing how, they found something that money couldn't buy. They found their hopes and dreams for the future weren't actually dead. They found out that even though it looked like the rest of their life was pretty much over and done with, that it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something that was greater than they had imagined that they could experience. Like I said, we'll shy away. We have these traumatic experiences, and it causes us to run, it causes us to fear. But they found out that God raised up Christ, the same Jesus that they saw shamed, that the same person that they saw beaten, the same person that was embarrassed and turned in. They found out that he got up, and when he got up completely different than they put him in there. They put him in there embarrassed and bloody. They put him in there beaten, and they put him in there expecting that he was done. And he gets up and has all power in his hand. He gets up and he's recovered. He gets up, he carries a couple of wounds that I'm going to talk about in a second, but he wasn't the bloody mess that he went in there as. It's not about how they bury you. It's a question of if you get up and how you're going to get up when you're done. We experience all kinds of tragedies, and we experience all kinds of situations. What tells the story of who we are isn't who tries to bury us. It's not what we're accused of. It's not what anybody else says we are, but it's what we get up, who we are when we get up out of there. And we do get up out of there, and we can and will get up out of there more powerful because we share in his resurrection. The same power that got God up, that got Christ up out of the grave, dwells in our body and quickens us. It says that the scripture says that the same spirit that raised Jesus from the dead shall quicken your mortal body. Believers don't understand a lot of times just how much power we carry and just what it is that keeps us going when we really feel like shutting down. Don't understand necessarily what it is that drives us to continue to try to live, to continue to try to triumph when everything around us and when the circumstances around us say it's not worth trying anymore. You can't get through that stone. Your hopes, your dreams have already passed. You might as well go back to what you're used to doing. Sit and grieve, sit and mourn. Peter got up and went fishing because that's what he used to know. And a lot of us will go back to doing what we used to do, but we have a power in us. The power that was able to bring a body out of a grave gives us the ability to get up and stand up and say, I'm better now than I was when I went in there. You thought I was... I struggle between two different topics or subjects for this message, but one of them would have been how you like me now. They beat Christ. They thought he was done. They thought that they had destroyed his reputation. They thought they had destroyed his integrity. 3 days later, he comes up with all power in his hands. He comes up conquering death, conquering hell, saying that there is nothing, there is no force on this earth that will stop me from being able to provide you the life, the experience, the relationship that I promised I could have. I know it was shaky for a few days. I know you didn't necessarily know how this whole thing was going to play out. I tried to tell you, but I can understand why it's difficult for you to understand it. Nobody's ever gotten up before. Tried to explain it to you. But now, 3 days later, early in the morning, met these women who were considered lower class. Not the disciples who had trained, but a bunch of women. And I say that because that's how they looked at them. Came and received revelation. They came and they received affirmation, and they received a mission and a purpose from God. He said, go tell everybody else. Whereas I had no hope for they had no hope for the future. They had no knowledge and understanding of what was going to befall them. They lived in they did not allow their fear to paralyze them into apathy. Complacency is the refuge of people who have lost all hope and don't have the strength to confront it anymore. Complacency, falling back into what we're comfortable with and what we're used to, losing the will and the desire to believe in something greater is what happens when we buy into the situations that we're presented with as they are and forget about the fact that we have promise from God that what exists now is not what is always going to exist. We can, if Christ got up, that means that there's nothing that we encounter that we can't get up from. There is no loss that we can suffer. There is no pain that we can have that has the power to destroy us, because if God was able to raise up Christ from out of the grave, if he was able to elevate somebody that society tried to shame, if he was able to establish the ministry of somebody that people tried to disregard, then he can do the exact same thing in us, because the same Spirit got Jesus up out the grave, dwells in our body, quickens us, makes us powerful, makes us people of consequence, gives us opportunity for the future, and gives us an advocate. One of the things that we talked about is the fact that we talked about, and I'm almost done, is the fact that Christ operated to, or the hope was that he would confer to his people honor that they couldn't attain on them for themselves, that he would allow them to experience a quality of living that they couldn't obtain for themselves. One of the mechanisms in the culture that through which that happened was patronage. Patronage was where I don't have access to somebody, but I know somebody that does. I don't have access to the wealthy person, but I know somebody who does, and this person who does can go to the powerful person and go to the wealthy person and secure what I need for the moment, so that way I can get through. It was a way of entering into a dyadic contract or a relationship with somebody that you didn't normally have access to. And Christ, in being resurrected, and Jesus in being honored by God, becomes a patron for his people, to where it doesn't matter what we stand in need of. We have an advocate. We have an intermediary who can go before God, who can secure what we need, and who can provide us with the strength, with the resources, with the emotional healing, with the deliverance, with the salvation that we need for our current present-day circumstances. This is why this is where we get the idea that because he lives, I can face tomorrow. Because he lives, all fear is gone. God holds my future, and I have access. I'm not alone. I'm not alone. I don't have to wrestle and struggle by myself. I don't have to wrestle and wonder and be overcome by fear. And I don't have to be overcome by grief, because I have a risen Savior, because I am in relationship with somebody that God affirmed, that God established his relation, that the reality of who he was, and God validated his credentials. Last thing I want to talk about before I wrap this up is the fact that even though Christ came back better, he came back in a glorified body, he still had a couple of scars. He had the piercing in his side, and he had the holes in his hand. And it's an interesting idea as to why those things remained, but they ended up being functional. One of the questions that they initially, when they were resurrected, dealt with when Christ was resurrected, is this a spirit? Is this a ghost? Am I seeing a spirit, or was he resurrected in his physical body? And so they were able to touch him, but how do we know it's really you? I got 2 holes in my hand and a mark in my side. Who else you think it is? I got these. If you're not sure it's me, here's a couple of scars that I have that proves that I went through what I said I went through, that prove that I am who I am. It was a way of being able to authenticate to other people that he was who he said he was. A lot of us carry scars. A lot of us carry situations and wonder, when are these things going to heal over? They don't always do that. Sometimes it's a way of being able to validate and establish your testimony. Because if you say I went through hell and back and don't have a mark on you, somebody is going to have a hard time understanding and relating to that. But the things that we carry with us sometimes that we wish would go away, that we wish that would close in, are things that God can use to establish that you've been through what you say you have. That you are real, that you are not a super sane, or that you are not beyond the experience and the pain that everybody else feels, but you are real and you can experience these things. He gives purpose to the scars. He gives purpose to the pain, and then gives you strength to be able to carry and to be able to walk with those things. Whatever God allows to stay, whatever remains, is functional, has purpose, shows people that you are and who you say you are, and you've been through what you've said you've been through. We're built to rise. We are built to come back. because we have the spirit of that got Christ up out of the dead, that got Christ up from the dead, living us. We are built to, I don't know if you've ever been fishing. You've got those little bobbers that you put at the end of the line, and you throw it out there, and you've got the bait on there, and they get drug and they go underwater. But they're built, no matter how long they're under there, they're built to come back up. We operate the same way. It doesn't matter what gets attached to us at a moment. It doesn't matter what tries to grab hold of us. We are designed to be able to come back up from tragedies, from disappointments, from oppression, from abuse, from being neglected, from being mistreated, from divorce. All of these things that we have attached to us sometimes, that we wrestle with, that we struggle with, that we endure. We're built to come back. We are designed and built to endure. And the reason that we know that there's nothing else that can happen that can tear us down, that there's nothing else that will happen that will break us, is because Jesus got up. If you have power over death, there's not much else that's going to happen that you don't have the ability to be able to endure. And that is the significance of what they found in the resurrection. Eventually they get to thinking about eternity. Eventually they get to thinking about the propitiation for sin and the sacrificial lamb. But on the day he got up, what they saw was a renewal of hope. What they saw was a restoration of a better future. What they saw were the affirmation of the promises of God, that my life is going to be better. I am going to have an honor. I'm going to experience a better quality of living because Christ got up. The morning after, having experienced tragedy, the morning after disappointment, the morning after having their world shattered, the morning after they engaged in worship. They didn't know it and understand it by that name and by that term, but they engaged in trying to show, I love Christ. And if we find ourselves able to re-engage with God, in spite of not having all the answers, in spite of having obstacles and things we don't understand, and emotional baggage and being afraid, if we're able to re-engage with God, we can find revelation. We can find strength. We can find comfort. We can find affirmation that whatever you think is the end, it's not over. Whatever you think your destiny is because this set of situations has befallen you, it doesn't determine what your destiny is. Your destiny is determined by God, and he has glorious destinies for all of his people. So I hope someone was blessed. This is what they saw and why it was so impactful that Christ got up. If Christ didn't get up, they would be most miserable of all men. But because he did rise, they have hope. We have hope. We are unbreakable. We may bend over way, way, way low sometimes, but we are unbreakable. We are built to rise again from whatever circumstances life may send our way and whatever things that we may struggle with. So I hope that you all were blessed by this. We have dinner.